So today's podcast sounds like it's a little bit about teaching people how to be good parents. Is that right?
I'm going to pause there because I'm not a parent, and so I'm not sure if I really want to.
Well, that's where I was going to go with that. Robert, in your extensive experience in raising young men and young women in this country, can you tell us a little bit about how to be a parent?
I probably can't tell you how to be a parent, but I can tell you what parents in these circumstances have faced and how they've overcome them.
Okay, well, let's start there then.
That's probably the smarter way to go about it.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Ask Avidian podcast. This is Jake Borbidge, Chief Investment Officer with Avidian Wealth Solutions, and Robert Palmer is back in the saddle again. And today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of wealthy families eventually have to deal with. I like to think about it as wealth transfer. Robert, you've probably got a better way of capturing the challenge between a wealthy family that is kind of exiting out of their wealth and how do they give it to their children.
Yeah, a lot of people can come up with a lot of cool solutions for how to go about wealth transfer. And it's kind of funny. You'll always hear things about business entities, trusts, transfers, sales, installment notes, lots of cool mechanisms that you can deploy in order to make that wealth transfer efficient. But actually, in these meetings, typically, the number one concern they have isn't necessarily how to do the wealth transfer. It's how is this wealth transfer going to impact my family, and is it going to last? So when I'm sitting in a room, and this has happened at least 3 or 4 times within the last, let's call it month and a half, with individuals that have a pretty good net worth and have great business entities that they're managing, they ask themselves, my kid's going to eventually come into this money, is going to be able to collect on this cash flow machine that I've created. I don't want it to corrupt them. And the other side of that coin is they don't want just a lump sum of money to lead to the child becoming miserable. And I think that's a very forward-thinking way to go about analyzing the circumstance from a psychological standpoint. I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, but what I can tell you is that I've seen multiple instances, particularly over the last 2 years, where ultra-high net worth individuals leave behind large sums of money, and it not just causes a lot of conflicts with children, but it winds up with them not being happy. They're not leading the life that they thought they were going to lead, or the life that their parents wanted them to lead. Okay,
so let's start with like a setup, right? How do we start with setting up the parents to be in the right situation to, maybe it's transfer the wealth and then initiate that discussion with the kids on, how to enjoy the wealth, right, without having it destroy their lives?
Yeah, and I think the simplest explanation, or the simplest solution, I should say, would be delegation of responsibility. Successful parents, they spend a lot of time building these enterprises, and that can sometimes lead to there being a deficit of the children really learning from the best teachers that they possibly could learn from, which is their parents. Mm-hmm. And so kind of bringing the children into the fold, having an open and honest conversation about the circumstances and teaching them the steps to get to where they were is essential for them to understand how to navigate the waters when those parents are no longer around. So I think I'll give you an example that came up recently. So there was an individual that didn't want their children to know exactly how much they were worth because, again, they were worried, the kids are going to think there's a windfall for me, and they're basically going to do drugs, alcohol, and party, which they probably could for the next 100 years given what they stood to inherit. But instead, this individual went and talked with several of his friends who were in similar circumstances, and he actually sat down with his kids, and while not disclosing exactly the sum of money that would come to them, he did explain to them exactly what they had to do to get it. So if they wanted to learn more and they wanted to see what was out there, they had to come into the fold and run the business alongside them, or at least occupy positions within the business to learn how to do various things on the day-to-day and build it. Because if you think about it, if you step back and someone hands you $1 million and you didn't earn that $1 million, there's a bunch of good habits that you have missed out on, right? You haven't built it yourself. You don't understand what went into earning that money. And therefore, when you get it, you're not going to understand how to navigate it moving forward. So you really need to start backwards engineering how to introduce those steps and those responsibilities to ensure that if there is a windfall that falls into a kid's pocket, they know what they need to do to make sure it lasts and it's not negligently burnt on things like parties.
So we take care of the wealth transfer side of the equation a lot of times, helping out with the logistics there. The parents, I guess what we're saying is that it's on them to start the knowledge transfer side of things, right? What did you have to do to earn this wealth? What have you done to preserve it? And what pieces of the puzzle have you organized to help transition it, right? So parents' job is kind of knowledge transfer, at least getting that kid interested in learning about, whether it's wealth creation, wealth preservation, whatever their goals are, and then responsibly managing it. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I think a good way to think about it is if you built a business and let's say you're deploying a sophisticated strategy for wealth transfer. So you have a few businesses or one business, you wrap it into a family limited partnership, and now you put your kids within the family limited partnership as owners, right? So now they're effectively owners of the businesses you've built. Now, what you want to do is essentially have them come in and understand the machine that you've constructed. Don't just let them sit back and collect on cash flow that's being printed by the success that you've made. Instead, get them into the nitty-gritty. Let them understand how to do an oil change, how to replace the belt, how to build the engine itself. Because when they stand behind the wheel, they're going to need to know what exactly they're piloting and how exactly to operate it.
Okay, so then they get that knowledge transfer. I think what I've seen a lot of our wealthy families, they are also not do-it-yourselfers. They understand that there's a limitation to their expertise, and they understand where that limit is and where they need to bring in really smart people to help, right? And so we talk about those individuals as somebody that can be your kind of force multiplier in any area of expertise, whether that's running a business, whether it's running your portfolio, whether it's understanding your health and your fitness routine, right? Bringing in the smartest people that you can find to help support you in all those decisions, I think is a knowledge transfer that can't be missed, right?
That's right. And it's also time management. I think that is the crux of this here. Individuals who are very successful, they don't have time. And so they need to be able to delegate responsibility elsewhere. I mean, that's where advisors and consultants and just a good professional team comes into play. And so you want, ideally, your family members that you want involved in the business to be part of that professional team, but they need exposure to it. They need to understand it. So you're exactly right.
So maybe one example there would be, if you as the parent, the patriarch, the individual passing on that wealth, if you have a trusted advisor in any of these areas, but we can talk about the financial advisor one, I would recommend you start bringing your children along to those meetings so they can see, what happens in that kind of meeting. What decisions does the, owner of the assets need to make and need to bring in? What responsibilities on their shoulders? What areas does the advisor assist them in and kind of support their decisions? Don't keep them in the dark. Don't assume that you're doing them a service by handling all that for them. Bring them into the fold. Again, maturity, obviously they have to be ready for those decisions, ready to understand that there's going to be some weight that they're going to start carrying at some point in the future. So we're talking a little bit about logistics. Let's talk a little bit about purpose, right? So, obviously, there's different purposes. Everybody has a different purpose for their wealth, and we try to codify that in estate planning. But I think a lot of times, if wealth is just transferred, but there's no push behind it in terms of like the intention behind the wealth, it can flounder, right? Anything without purpose is effectively directionless. And so, whether the purpose of the creators of that wealth remains the same, I think one thing that has been very clear to me is that if there's no purpose, that's going to be an issue with the transfer of that wealth, right? Because there's no true north.
Yeah, I think Denzel Washington had a pretty good quote on that. I think he said something along the lines of, if you don't have a goal, you're not going to go anywhere. And if you can't establish consistency, you'll never make it.
It's a great quote.
Yeah.
So how do we help, I guess, establish purpose, right? And maybe it's, starting the discussion, right? The children are starting to engage with the parents on just coming to some of these meetings, right? How do they start transferring the purpose of the wealth, the mission statement of whatever their family's portfolio might look like?
Yeah, and I would say that kind of starts with a private family conversation. You're sitting around the dinner table and you're talking to your kids honestly about what it is they're looking to do. And if it winds up that they don't really want to be involved in the business, because that does happen more often than not.
Yeah.
Not everybody is cut out to run a multi-million-dollar business, and some of them want to take a back seat. Well, okay, that's very important for the parents to understand, because if you're going to go through a legacy plan and you want the wealth to last, that means you need to bring on a different professional in order to operate the ship. The kids are ultimately going to be part of it. Their name is still going to be probably as an owner or maybe a limited partner of some kind, but they're going to be off doing their own thing. And that's important to understand ahead of time, because you don't want someone who doesn't want to be there. So let me tell you a story that I think might illuminate an example like that. So we had an individual with a child who didn't really want to take over the business, but did have some charitable inclinations. So one of the things that the patriarch and matriarch constructed for them beyond the business was something like a private foundation, right? An outlet where this wealth could be channeled. And yes, there's some tax efficiency to that, but also it appealed to the passion of the child. There was a way that they could construct their wealth and also have it go toward a good cause and have their kid involved at the same time. Now, conversely, I've also seen it go to the negative, where those types of conversations weren't had preemptively when drafting the legacy plan. And so when it came time for the kid to step up, he didn't want anything to do with the business. And as a consequence of that, they didn't really understand the circumstances when their parents passed away. And as a result, there was a lot of complexity. So here's literally what happened. There was insufficient liquidity to cover tax bills, which was actually a huge bill in the sum of millions. And as a consequence of that, moving forward, they weren't sure exactly what their lifestyle was going to look like. They literally thought they were going to have to start all over again from zero, because even though there was plenty of money on paper, there were all these bills and creditors coming due, and they didn't understand the variables that were being thrown at them. And that was due to essentially a lack of communication and transparency when it came to the family governance and when it came to the operation of the business that their family had built.
And I think, one of the things that you'll find too when you go through those examples is that the individuals dealing with that surprise outcome, it's typically after the loss of a loved one.
That's right.
Which is not the best time to be in a position to be making those difficult life decisions, right? Cool, calm, and collected is kind of where you want to be, and even better if the decision makers are all at the same table at once, right? But when it's after the loss of a loved one, and then you're thrust into this situation where you got to make all these big life decisions with something that you didn't know that you were going to have to deal with, that's a really tough position to be as the kid receiving the wealth.
That's exactly right. And where I've seen this work really effectively is when there is a gradual implementation or a gradual increase of responsibility that's delegated to the next generation. So, for example, I know of a family where essentially the children don't know the full scope of their net worth, but they do know that there's money there. And they do know that where the large portion of the money was created, they're not going to get that. They're going to get something else. And so what the family wound up doing was creating a different type of business for the kids to operate that was more in line with their interests. And what they're doing is bringing the kids in and slowly giving them more and more managerial responsibilities over that sort of subsidiary business. And in time, they're effectively going to get the best education possible for how to run it efficiently. And that's just the reality of the education system today. When you go to school, it gives you a good foundation to springboard off of, but you don't have the real world practical experience to navigate things efficiently. And that comes with this sort of delegation of responsibility over time.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that, Robert. Let's pivot to a little bit on the side of responsible wealth transfer. What are some things that you're seeing as you work with clients that you can share with the audience today that might help them? Just kind of give them some things to think about going forward.
Well, the very first thing I'm going to say is get an estate plan. It sounds generic, but everyone delays on it. And I promise you, no matter how copacetic your family dynamic is, whenever there is a death and there's money involved, there will be drama, there will be conflict, and it is best to plan for it ahead of time to avoid all of that and make sure that, I'm going to call it, the structural integrity of your family stays intact. Not just your wealth, but just for the sake of peace of mind for your family. Once the estate plan is set up, then you can kind of start getting into more complex strategies. But what does that estate plan look like? What you really want to do is account for things that may not be issues today, but could be issues tomorrow. So by that, I mean, there are parents who are not really concerned about their kids doing drugs or getting into alcohol or spending down the money, but that doesn't mean they're not planning for that as a potentiality. So they will create trusts, for example, that have specific provisions where in the event those circumstances come to fruition, there is a limitation on what the access to those funds will be. And so that's, in legal terms, that's called the hand beyond the grave. It's a way to make sure that the legacy lasts from a financial standpoint, but also that if there are mistakes made, such as just bad habits or bad spending, there's a way to account for it and a way to recover from it. And at the end of the day, life's going to throw a lot of variables. You're not going to be able to anticipate everything, and second chances are necessary. A good estate plan grants a second chance when mistakes come about.
That's a good way to put it, Robert. Let's talk a little bit about how Avidian can partner with some of these families. What are the things that we'll do, like practical things, to help on the transfer side, and then also, as the kids, and we're saying kids, really adult children,
Yes.
as they receive that wealth, how do we help them pick up where their parents have left off?
Yeah, great question. So the most common solution is an irrevocable trust, either transferring business interest or funds or perhaps ownership within a portfolio. You move that into an irrevocable trust where you have an open conversation with the beneficiary. In this case, that would be the second generation or the adult child in your scenario. And you basically tell them what's going on. Now, they don't have unfettered access to it. In fact, they may not be able to touch it for years after the trust is created. But you can have an open conversation about what's there, how it operates, and how you intend for it to operate, and then codify it within the language of the trust to ensure it continues down that path in perpetuity for as long as the trust can last. And I would say the second stage of that is having a conversation with your professional team. Right? If you're working with a financial planner or an advisor or an institution like Avidian, for example, you bring the kids into the meeting to talk about how the trust operates, to talk about why it's there, the purpose behind it, and you just have an honest conversation as to where you want the future to go and what it could look like.
So I like to think of an example on wealth creation. I typically think about, your wealth as water filling up a bucket. And you're spending your whole life just trying to make sure that faucet is at maximum all the time, right? It's filling that bucket up as fast as possible. But what you don't realize, or maybe you do, but you don't have time to deal with it, is that the world is constantly trying to poke holes in your bucket, right? And some of those holes are really big, right? The government tries to poke a really big hole in your bucket in the form of, if you don't have a proper estate plan, there's going to be a big hole. There's other things that come along, whether it's just waste. I mean, things as small as cash drag and be little pinholes in your bucket that drain your wealth out over time that you may not even notice. But if you left that bucket untended for a long period of time, it's going to be sufficiently lower than when you left it. I guess irresponsible spending, again, could be a pinhole depending on the size of your wealth, but drains your wealth over time. And so, I just like to think about Avidian as, our job is to make sure that those holes are plugged, that any big ones we address first, but that we're minimizing the drain on your wealth over time so that when that spigot gets turned off, the bucket just doesn't go dry the day after.
That's right. And I'm going to put aside market risk for a second and just talk about lifestyle risk, because I think that is probably the thing that impacts the second generation the most. They are accustomed to the lifestyle that their parents have introduced them to. And there's not really a full appreciation of the cost that goes into that. And I'm not just talking about the monetary cost. I'm talking about the work to get to the point where the monetary cost doesn't become such a big deal.
Yeah. Yep.
And if that lifestyle is continued moving forward, especially where inflation is right now, it's going to burn through the cash quicker than they anticipate. And as a consequence of that, if they don't understand how the engine can create more cash, it's just going to burn quicker and quicker and quicker. And that aggregates, and you could say it's a force multiplier with all those pinholes that you were highlighting a moment ago. So I think that only reiterates why it's so important to have these conversations about how wealth is made, how to generate more of it over time, and make sure that that lifestyle creep that essentially is one of the biggest drains that Generation 2 faces doesn't pose such a challenge in the future.
Yeah, and I think, if we had to kind of recast that in terms of dad language, you want to think about the things that bring you fulfillment, the things that bring you, joy and satisfaction in your life. And, when I talk to my kids, I give them the Starbucks example, right? So they're teenagers. Starbucks is very relevant to them and to their friends. And I talked to them about, you could go to Starbucks and they like the refresher, right? The Starbucks refresher drink. It's a tasty beverage. I understand that, especially in Houston. Very cool and refreshing on a hot day. But that Starbucks refresher is, after a tax and tip, it's probably getting close to $10 now with inflation. That's a pretty steep price to pay for any beverage. When you look at what's in that beverage, it's about 16 ounces of water, or maybe 10 ounces of water and 8 ounces or 4 ounces of ice, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of food coloring, and that's all you've got for your $10. So you drink that beverage, it's gone. It has served its purpose, and you're out the $10. I think you can take that example that spending on what a free glass of water could do, but you've made that glass of water cost $10.
That's right.
You can take that example and apply it to numerous situations in life where you're choosing the Starbucks refresher version of the thing that you can just get by turning on the tap and adding a little bit of ice out of the fridge.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. The difference between doing it yourself and delegating it elsewhere. Yeah. Until your time becomes valuable, meaning until you're producing more than you're consuming, you shouldn't be delegating.
Love it, Robert. This has been really interesting. I learned something. I will be a better parent for it. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you guys want to dig any deeper or reach out with some questions, come visit us at avidianwealth.com.